Hey everyone, welcome back to the Layback Podcast. Joining us today is Dr. Emily Ferree. She is a physical therapist, biomechanist, and probably 35 other things that I can't even begin to explain. But before I do butcher anything, of course, I'm going to punt it to her and let her take care of the rest. She does run her own physical therapy clinic out in Southern California. And if you guys maybe didn't know, this is like the one cool fact I definitely know about Emily. She was a soccer player that was then thrust into the baseball world. Thankfully, we have an outsider taking care of us a little bit. We'll probably talk a little bit about that in the process. So, Emily, I apologize if I stole your fun fact, but I felt like I needed to get that out.
No, that's great. I know people always want to ask me, like, did you play softball? I'm like, not a day in my life. Not for one second did I ever play a sport that involves throwing. I did play volleyball a little bit in my youth, but that's about the extent of my hand-eye coordination. So I always tell people, do as I say, not as I do. I can, in slow motion, demonstrate a pitching delivery really flawlessly, and I know exactly what's supposed to happen. Do not ask me to throw the ball at any time because my brain couldn't actually coordinate my body to do it, but I know what's supposed to happen.
Well, if I can interrupt real quick
Yeah.
before the bio, how is your humeral retroversion?
You don't want to know. That was simple. It's not important. It's not important.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, that stuck with me forever from the first time I heard you speak at what was that? Maybe the 2022 Bridge seminar, I want to say.
Okay.
I think you opened up with saying, first and foremost, everyone, throw like a girl, not real. It's just because girls weren't exposed to humeral retroversion of throwing a ball at young ages, so they just can't get the layback that the male athletes that we usually label as having that access. So that stuck with me
Yeah.
forever, and it's more pertinent now because my wife and I are due with a baby girl in August. So
Yes, congratulations.
thank you.
That's my biomechanics fun fact because everything in movement is physics, right? Like we are all bound by the same laws of physics. And with little kids, when girls start to play throwing sports, we hand them a softball, which is bigger and heavier, and they have smaller hands. And so we hand them a ball that they can't palm. So they have to turn it up. What happens when you turn a ball up? You throw with the mechanics that we call throw like a girl. That's because we've constrained girls with external constraints and then punish them for those external constraints. Whereas little boys, we hand them a baseball, which is small enough to palm and it's lighter. And so they can actually throw it with good mechanics because we've provided the external constraints to do that. So if you want your little girls to throw well, give them the same balls that we give little boys and they will learn great throwing mechanics.
It is almost like motor learning is a real thing. It's crazy how that works,
Oh,
right?
it's like that. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. Well, sorry to dive deep right away. We can back it up, and I actually do want you to take us through your bio. I know we hit bits and pieces of it in that process, but please, would love to hear more about you.
So first off, I am a physical therapist. I'm a physical therapist by degree and trade. So I got my doctorate of physical therapy. And then I'm a double board certified sports clinical specialist. I'm in the sports performance world. So I have my strength and conditioning certification, and I'm a certified manual therapist. And then I did extra training outside of school to learn all the biomechanics. So I also do biomechanical analyses and kind of the analysis of the physics of human and sport movement. I wear a lot of hats, but I wear a lot of hats not to be kind of a jack of all trades and a master of none, but because I think in order to actually address the full spectrum of an athlete, you have to be hitting all of those elements. I can't just be a manual therapist, make somebody feel better for a day or two. I have to be able to fix the problem. Fixing the problem forces you to jump into the sports performance world and be able to train athletes. You can't just be giving them banded clamshells and expect to return them to the field. Like you have to be able to dive into that world of sports performance and know how to train an athlete. And if I'm actually going to fix the problem, I can't just send an athlete back to do exactly what they were doing when they got injured. So I have to be able to know biomechanics and know movement and then know how to train that movement. And so to me, the answer to treat athletes at a high level is you have to be able to kind of go in that full 360 and address the full picture of what the athlete does and who they are as not just a mover, but as a whole system.
I'm glad you said full 360. My exact words were going to be, it just sounds like you're doing full spectrum athlete care, literally from intervention all the way back to peak performance and everything in between. Is just from following a bit of what you do. I know this is getting away from some of what we do want to talk about. It does seem like you are doing a lot of check-ins or spot work with guys knowing that you're working with such a high caliber of athlete that
Hmm.
you are forced to come in and do the manual therapy to help somebody feel better before their next game or next outing or during the football season between Sunday to Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the real beauty of the type of practice that I've cultivated is that a lot of the athletes that I treat are with me year round. And so you're training them in the off season and prepping them for what they need to do. But if and when they get injured, you get to run the rehab process or are there to run the rehab process. And then in the middle of the season, when little things come up that maybe aren't keeping them out of practice or games, but are issues that they're dealing with, then you get to address those as well. And there's all these trends, and people love to like argue about what's best practice with physical therapy. And there's kind of this divide in our profession of manual therapy versus TheraX and what's better. And I always tell people, you've never treated a professional athlete if you're going to land yourself on one of those two spectrums, because the answer is both. Because when an athlete comes to me and they have to play a game in 2 days, when they leave their session with me, they have to feel better. I don't care how good you are at prescribing therapeutic exercise. There's not a therapeutic exercise that's going to make that athlete feel better if they have a soft tissue injury. Like, yes, you're getting them on the road to healing it, but in 2 days, they have to feel better. And they have to feel better when they leave my office, or else I'm not going to get the buy-in. So that's what manual therapy does. Manual therapy addresses in the moment. Can I do something that makes this athlete feel better, that allows this injury to be manageable, that can get them onto the field to practice tomorrow? Therapeutic exercise can't do that, but manual therapy can't actually fix the issue. So in the short term, manual therapy helps us, but in the long term, therapeutic exercise helps us. So the answer is both. But I'll tell you right now, if a professional athlete comes to see you and they don't leave your session feeling better, they're not coming back.
I'm really glad you went down that route. I guess it's not something that I think about a ton, but when we step back and look at the baseball rehab injury world or just rehab for high athletes, I guess the industry has kind of shifted for the most part in a good way, focusing more on therapeutic exercise from my perspective, because now we're getting athletes better, healthier, long term.
Yeah.
But we have gone so far to the therapeutic exercise perspective with better understanding of loading principles and all the things that we ultimately need for a few months down the road. However, like you said, if the athlete doesn't feel better, it really doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot, because we can't get to that point where we can be loading up a squat bar again or making cuts on a field or rotating at the speeds you need to rotate coming down a mound.
And ultimately, like, if there's things that we can do with our hands or with our modalities that it can affect an athlete's physiology, it can affect blood flow. We know we can basically stimulate fibroblastic activity. Like, there's things that we can do that speed up the body's own ability to heal itself, because ultimately the body's healing itself, right? But there's things that we can do to help facilitate that. So if I can even speed that up by like a day or two with my hands, I have to, because time is of the essence for a lot of these people, especially if they're in season.
Well, before we shift out of it, I like the route we've gone down here, so I'm going to ask a couple more questions on it if that's all right. For a elbow injury in a baseball player, what does manual care normally look like for you? And then I feel like the therapeutic exercises become a little more obvious as time has gone on.
For
That's what
sure.
we spend this entire podcast talking about, basically, if we ever bring on a physical therapist or someone in the S&C world.
Mhm.
But what does the manual therapy look like? Obviously, we want someone to feel good. I think when we hear manual therapy as an industry, we just automatically go to massage. But I'm sure there's so much more that comes from that umbrella term of massage. So I'd love if you could just open up that book for us.
Yeah, even if we were just going to deep dive into, like, I think when we hear like the term like soft tissue mobilization or massage more colloquially, like you just think about what a massage therapist does. But if you break down a really good manual therapist, there's, deep tissue work, there's ART or active release techniques, there's pin and stretch techniques that are both designed to release or decrease trigger points. There's fascial manipulation where we're affecting more the fascial plane and connective tissue adhesions. There's cross friction, which we're basically trying to rough up tendons to get fibroblasts to activate to increase blood flow to the area. There's like effleurage, where we're working on more lymphatic drainage and getting swelling out of an area. So, I mean, if you just take massage as this umbrella term, somebody who's actually very good at manual therapy is actually assessing the tissue, figuring out what needs to happen, and then doing more specialized techniques than just rubbing something, right? So I think that's why a lot of PTs who want to be really in the upper echelon, they try and move away from things like massage or soft tissue because they don't want to be lumped in with massage therapists. They're like, I'm a doctor, doctor of physical therapy. I'm not a massage therapist. I don't want to be confused as a massage therapist. But if you're really an expert in manual therapy, you are using your doctoral level of education to assess what's going on with the tissue, and you're using the art form of our profession to feel what you need to feel, to assess, and then to pick a very specialized form of manual therapy to address what you need to address, focusing on what physiologic change do I want to make in this tissue. So it really depends what's wrong with the athlete. With a lot of elbow injuries, so many UCL injuries come with concurrent common flexor tendon issues or flexor mass strains, adhesions, trigger points, things like that. So again, depending on what exactly is wrong with the tissue, we're going to pick our modality based off of that. But a lot of it has to do with addressing concurrent flexor tendon or flexor mass issues. And then a lot of it's based on essentially just trying to get blood flow to the area because again, your body heals itself. Inflammation is not the enemy. And inflammation is essentially, especially in those first 3 days, it is a chemical trigger to send out signals to bring in the mediators that our body sends cellularly to initiate tissue regeneration, new tissue synthesis, to initiate basically that whole renovation process in your soft tissue to heal and create new tissue. So some of it's to bring blood flow, some of it's to address adhesions or trigger points or things in the muscle, but it really depends on what's going on with the athlete. So you have to be able to assess that.
Slight shift here, but still semi-related because it seems like it's that kind of time of year. I guess anytime in the spring and early summer is that time of year for Tommy John surgeries. But
Yep.
constantly I'm being asked, how quickly should I mobilize after surgery? How quickly should I start loading after surgery? Obviously, every athlete is individual case dependent, and there are so many factors that go into the decisions that you make. But from your perspective, your experience, generally what time frames are you looking at, or maybe what biases do you have in looking to mobilize an athlete again or letting them get outside of a sling?
That's a great question. Some of it depends on what type of repair the athlete got, and it really majorly depends on if they also had a common flexor tendon repair too. So a lot of elbow blowouts that we see, like through one pitcher grabs his arm, like it blew in that moment. It wasn't kind of the slowly building pain issue, and then we did an MRI and realized it was mostly torn. Like when we truly get blowouts, a lot of times there is tearing of that common flexor tendon. Now, if the surgeon had to go in and reattach a common flexor tendon and do a common flexor tendon repair, the process is so much slower because really the fragile part of that repair is the common flexor tendon. It's not really the UCL, it's the common flexor tendon. So there's a lot more precautions if that happens. Assuming there's not a common flexor tendon repair, athletes are usually in the brace for 6 weeks. And there is a progressive range of motion progression over those 6 weeks. They gain about 10 degrees in both directions every week. And that's largely not done by manual mobilization. That is just done by changing the lock mechanism on the brace. So basically the brace has a dial with a degree of range of motion, and you are just increasing it 10 degrees every week in both directions and allowing the athlete to move. So it's mostly active, not passive. With Tommy John or UCL repair surgeries, we really do not want to force the issue. Like we are not trying to overpressure at the end of range of motion. There's not a lot of elbow joint range of motion stuff we need to do. So most of that is, it honestly comes back on its own, range of motion wise. And then as far as loading, my big thing, if the athlete has not had a common flexor tendon repair, is early and often isometrics. Because the more in an isometric with the elbow at 90 degrees of flexion supported and in the brace, outside of internal rotation, so we avoid internal rotation initially, but outside of that, like you are not going to maladaptively load that elbow post-surgery. You're not adding valgus stress to that elbow, again, as long as you're not pulling into internal rotation early. But basically every other direction, we are doing isometrics early and often around the elbow and shoulder, because the more we can even just activate and turn on the forearm muscles in all directions, faster and better an athlete will be able to progress and load as their surgical precautions and timeline allows. But it's the same thing with basically every surgery. So I'm a huge proponent of, labral surgeries. We are doing isometrics day one. That is probably where I differ a little bit from some physical therapists who are a little bit more cautious around loading at the elbow. I feel very confident that I can do isometrics at the elbow and shoulder without adding those loads in the valgus direction at the elbow. That's going to be maladaptive after surgery. I feel very confident I can do that in a safe way. And we're doing that as much as possible because just the timeline of how much more quickly that they can progress is pretty night and day when you start that early.
I think that's great insight. I appreciate you going down that road. As I'm sure you could guess, I am a large proponent of isometrics myself, especially with objective loading to the area. I would like to think that's pretty obvious to the listeners at this point, given the platform and given the way we attack these things. But there was another selfish piece in there where now I'm regretting not being able to see you when I blew out my shoulder, because the way that I attacked it was very different, very slow, very conservative. I had labor man rotator cuff repair, and of course I ended up getting diagnosed with frozen shoulder later in the process because I was in my brace for so long because the surgery was so intensive. And then I just lose the ability to be a regular human being just a few months after surgery.
Yeah. I had a slightly off topic, but speaking of the shoulder, I had a NFL quarterback who had a labral repair and he rehabbed with me. And early and often isometrics is the only thing I did differently than another quarterback on the same team who had the same surgery, same timeline. He was back throwing 4 weeks earlier than the other athlete. The only difference was, one athlete stayed in rehab with the team, one athlete came in rehab with me. And the only difference was the early and often isometrics and how we took that first very early phase of rehab, and he progressed infinitely more quickly than this other athlete. So I just think that's huge and sometimes overlooked in our profession because people are so cautious post-surgery to do anything that's going to disrupt the repair. And surgeons especially are very cautious, as they should be, but it's a little bit self-protective, right? Like they did this surgery, it's a great surgery. And if you re-injure yourself or you do something to affect the repair, it looks bad on them, right? Like if they need to have a revision or something like that. So sometimes these surgical protocols are overly cautious. So we as physical therapists need to figure out and add a little bit of common sense into it sometimes of like, hey, if I do an isometric in neutral, in a supportive position, not in a direction that's going to load this specific tissue, like, am I really going to affect the repair? How much force actually needs to go through this area to actually affect the repair, to actually like loosen a bone screw or things like this? Like we need to add a little bit of common sense to it sometimes and be able to have a little bit of that critical thinking around surgical protocols that exist. So I'm not saying go outside of surgical protocols, but I'm saying within surgical protocols, we need to figure out really like how best can we start to load this limb.
Dumbing it down a little bit from my side, just to make sure I'm internalizing everything you said. From what you said a little bit earlier, unless the flexor mass is involved in the repair somehow, so assuming the flexor mass is not involved now, it basically means the only thing that was touched in the surgery was a ligament. Maybe there was a nerve transposition or something, but the muscle tendon unit was not impacted in any way. Thus, it's native strong tissue. The area might have swelling, the area might have inflammation or discomfort just because a foreign body went in there, but the muscle tendon unit actually wasn't impacted. So why would we hesitate in loading that? Is that fair? Am I on point with that?
Correct.
Cool. Okay. And then the other piece, early and often, being aggressive early seems like something that we as an entire industry could probably lean to a little bit more heavily from your perspective.
Yeah. And even like I said, finally people are catching up. We know our as a physical therapy professional, we're no longer recommending like RICE, right? If you have an injury, rest, ice, compression, elevation. And now it's kind of this like the colloquial term is like peace and love, where we're like protect it, but move it, but all this kind of stuff. Part of that early and often is movement too. So let's take TJ for an example. They're in an arm brace. A lot of guys spend the first 6 weeks like, I'm in this arm brace. I don't want to move it. I'm doing everything where they have these kind of range of motion boundaries that they're in per what week of rehab they're at. But in their like 24-hour day, they're really not moving a ton. I tell my guys every half hour, you are pumping out within your range of motion restrictions. So we are not going outside of their surgical protocols, but they are doing as much as humanly possible within their surgical protocol limitations. And they are moving that thing as often as they can. And the guys who are basically constantly moving their elbow, they have no issues progressing their range of motion week to week. The guys who do not move their elbows and are kind of stationary and like just do their rehab and then go home for the rest of the day, and they're kind of really protective of that elbow. Every time we go to move that brace 10 degrees, that end range of motion is hard to get. So the early and often goes into movement as well.
Switching now to the athlete or the patient in mind that you're working with, knowing everything you just explained, I feel like part of the hesitation from the athlete is fear. So how do you help an athlete overcome that fear that something isn't going to go wrong? Like you said, within the surgical protocol, everything you said to me makes complete sense because I feel like you mapped it out plain black and white. So is it really just honing in on that communication process, the education, making sure the athlete understands, or are there other things that we are missing?
I think so much of it goes into education. So having the athlete know like what happened in their elbow, like where did the graft come from? How is it placed in their elbow? How is their UCL now secured? What type of loads are going to disrupt that graft and just disrupt those anchors? What is their actual surgical protocol for rehab? What are we allowed to do? What are we not allowed to do? If they really understand those things, I tend to see that they feel more comfortable within like, okay, here's what you're not allowed to do. We aren't doing any of that, but here's what you are allowed to do. So we're going to do everything over here in this bucket. I find that they feel a little bit more comfortable with that. Just having the education of really understanding what's going on in their elbow and why they can or can't do certain things and really knowing, okay, these things are safe. So I can trust that I can do these things. And like with all rehab processes, like pain is present, right? And so educating them on like what types of discomfort are okay and which types of discomfort are not okay. So they kind of have an internal monitoring system that they can trust as well.
And I want to call back on something that we talked a little bit about earlier, just sticking with that range of motion theme. Is there ever a point where you do start to intentionally attack range of motion? Like, is there a point where it starts to become a red flag, even though early on you're expecting the athlete to gain it actively on their own? It's going to come with time. But is there like a line in the sand for you where you do say, like, hey, this is going to be a problem down the line. We need to do something about it?
Yeah, usually if by 10 weeks an athlete doesn't have full pain-free range of motion, it is a problem. Usually at the 8-week mark, and you can start attacking extension before you attack flexion. So usually by the 8-week mark, if they're like a little stiff into end range extension, like we'll start to do some manual therapy to basically encourage that end range extension. I'm still probably not even cranking flexion at that point. But once we get to the 10-week mark, if they do not have full range of motion, it's a problem. A lot of times that ends up in a referral back to the surgeon to figure out
Okay.
if it's a gross change in range of motion or like a gross discrepancy in range of motion, it might be a referral back to the surgeon. If we're like off by a few degrees each direction, then we're going to start manual therapy.
When you say off a few degrees either direction or a gross change, is that in relation to the contralateral limb, or is that in pre-surgical data if you're lucky enough to have it, or is it against the kind of, I guess, industry expected standard for range of motion?
A little bit of all three.
Okay.
So most pitchers have their flexion extension range of motion from teams because they do these generalized kind of assessments at the beginning of spring training. So usually we have that data pre-injury. What is your normal extension? With pitchers, especially pitchers who've had a lot of service time, sometimes extension range of motion changes. Most of us have what we call like negative range of motion into extension. So we have hyperextension. Most human beings do. Not all pitchers do. It's not uncommon to lose a degree or two of extension. Is that ideal? Not necessarily. Does it happen? Yes. So if a pitcher only had 0 degrees of extension, so they didn't have hyperextension before surgery, I'm not expecting them to get hyperextension after surgery. If we don't have that range of motion measurement from pre-surgery, we are comparing it to the other limb, the non-surgical limb. And then flexion-wise, flexion for the vast majority of the population, even pitchers, it should be limited by basically their muscle mass. So when their forearm hits their bicep, like that really should be the limiting factor. Their joint itself should not be the limiting factor. And the way we can tell this essentially is what flexion feels like. Like if I get to the end range flexion and it's kind of bouncy, like even if you like get there, like it's bouncy. If I get to their end range flexion and it's what we call a firm or a hard end feel, that is their capsule or their bony structure that's blocking me. That is a joint issue, and that really should not be your limiting factor with flexion. So some of it is how that end range of motion feels.
This has been incredibly educational thus far, and you may have provided the perfect segue into some of the biomechanical stuff.
Okay.
So what are issues that can arise that you might see if an athlete doesn't have full range of motion? Because you said it can become a problem down the line. So let's say you get a late stage rehab guy that comes to see you because he knows he's just not right. He's previous big league service time, coming back from an injury, and you notice the elbow doesn't have full range of motion or something. What are those red flags now? Like, are you seeing increased torques? Are you seeing poor patterning on a biomech report? Like, what does that really play out to be?
Yeah, a lot of times it's poor patterning. A lot of times it's poor arm path, and a lot of times that results in not matching planes of rotation between the arm and more proximal segments like the torso and the hips. And that most of the time is generally not due to a specific range of motion restriction, like, oh, I don't have enough I don't have end range elbow flexion, so my delivery is now different, because the only end range you get into with pitching is usually extension at the very end. But if an athlete doesn't have full range of motion, your body is smart and your body is self-protective neurologically without you even thinking about it. And so what we see a lot of times is these guys have deliveries that are protective, but ironically that ends up resulting in movements that actually add more torque to the elbow. For whatever reason, when a body is trying to protect the elbow, arms get really shovey. I don't know why that is, because it's very maladaptive. It does the opposite of what the body's trying to do, and it actually overexposes the elbow. But I think guys are not necessarily even cognitively, but maybe subconsciously, they're really afraid of like letting the arm like catch rotation and whip. But that is more protective of the elbow than shoving the elbow ahead of the body and letting that forearm fly out and basically leaving the elbow out to dry while your torso is rotating. And so I more see arm path issues, I think, more from a subconscious place of trying to protect the elbow, not necessarily because it can't get into a specific range of motion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's probably even what I was curious about. Is it the body's protective mechanism that's creating the issue, or is it the actual range of motion issue? So it sounds like it could be kind of chicken or egg to an extent, because if the
Yeah.
range of motion issue wasn't there, the body probably wouldn't be going through its protective mechanism. But the range of motion issue really doesn't matter that much. It's just you need to be able to overcome it somehow.
Yeah. Yeah. And in a healthy, unobstructed delivery, the arm is essentially catching rotational momentum from the torso and then getting whipped through. And when guys are coming back from an injury, it's hard to trust that. And so they want to have more control over their arm, I think, even subconsciously. And so they're trying to basically lead the delivery with their arm, and it ends up with them being shovey. And it usually ends up with them out of plane with their torso, because they're not trying to just let that arm catch. They're trying to control where the arm is and like carefully get into their delivery and protect it. And it ends up with all sorts of both performance and injury risk issues.
When you see something that doesn't look right, for lack of a better scientific term, at least in the way I'm asking the question, in a biomech report, what could that be? Obviously, there's tons that could go wrong, but normally in the populations that you are working with, so upper level athletes, whether it's draft prospect, high school kids, all the way up to Cy Young Award winners, what is the Houston we have a problem like flag that pops up in a
Yeah,
biomech report most often?
the red flags. That's a good question. I'm going to answer it, but the first thing I'm going to say that leads into this is I get asked all the time, like, what age a pitcher should get evaluated. And this leads into this question, I promise. But if your 11-year-old comes into the lab, I'm sorry, everything is wrong with his delivery. Like, so many things. He's not skeletally mature. He's not strong. Your kid needs to get stronger and play more baseball. Like, there's your biomechanics report right there. Now, when they're 14, 15, 16, yes, come in and see me and let's start addressing some things, because now your kid's throwing hard enough that if they're doing something bad, they are going to get hurt. But they also have more of the motor control to address it. They have established motor patterns at this point. When your kid's 9, 10, 11, every season they throw, their movement's going to change a little bit because their body is changing so much. And they are learning how to be an athlete in this world, essentially. So if that's too young, there's too many things wrong. There's going to be 18 different red flags. But by the way, when your kid's throwing 40 miles an hour, like, it's probably fine. So no offense to little leaguers. We love you. But getting a full biomechanics report at that age is probably a waste of your time and money. And it's going to look like catastrophe, right? Like your biomechanics report is going to look like, red flags everywhere. We're not trying to instill panic. Your kid needs to get strong. They need to work on not just being throwers, they need to work on just general athleticism, body awareness, body control. And so much of that stuff is going to clean itself up. But
so if I can interject real quick on that,
yes.
Emily, because great point. Is puberty kind of the cutoff line for you? If you're prepubescent, there's no point. If you're postpubescent, you're probably not going to be changing as much. So if you're serious enough about baseball, come on in, let's do it.
Yeah. And then I think like just the volume changed too at that point with travel ball, with adding in high school, with adding in like showcases and stuff that these kids are doing. So the volume change adds a level of risk that makes it like, yeah, let's assess you and make sure you're not doing something that's going to get you hurt. They're at the point where like they might be doing more specific strength training or things like that can either complement or not complement their delivery. So I just think that that whole time just lends itself better. Whereas like the actual way a kid moves just changes so much prepubescently because growth and motor control development, all of this stuff is still happening in such a chaos chasm in their little bodies that it's just too early and it's not going to be as helpful as you think it's going to be. So my biggest suggestion to parents with prepubescent baseball players is train them to be athletic, train them to be adaptable, train them to be reactive, train them in multiple ranges of motion, variability, like just allow them to be, from a motor control standpoint, like so flexible and adaptive in their bodies, not necessarily like literal flexibility, like be able to do the splits, but flexible in their motor patterns. Like they can throw from their knees, they can throw from their feet, they can turn and throw, they can jump and throw, like that type of flexibility, that type of variability that I'm talking about, because that's what's going to allow them to optimize motor planning, but also basically self-organize within their body to be more efficient. That's why we say like a lot of these professional pitchers that have made it so far and done so well, they played shortstop until they were 16 and then they became a pitcher only, right? So it's in these shortstops that have these very reactive, variable athletic throws, they can self-organize in their body very well. Like those are the most athletic kids. And they didn't get like stuck in one pitching pattern from the age of 11 because their dad was like, my kid's going to be a pitcher and he's going to play Division I baseball and I'm not going to have to pay for college. And so he just, from the age of 11 on, was like, you're only throwing downhill and you are a pitcher and I'm going to tell you how to throw at 11. When that kid at 11 doesn't have the motor pattern skills to do what you're asking him to do, and now you're just creating bad habits. But the kid who played shortstop till he was 16, his body had to learn to be efficient because he's throwing on the move, because he's turning and throwing, because he's reacting. And your body is smart. Your body wants to be efficient. And he really learned how to be an athlete. And that translates so much better to pitching than keeping a kid on the mound till he's from 11 years old all the way on.
Again, I'm going to interject because I feel like you made another great point that I would like to comment on. And eventually we will get to the biomech question.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like you just took my argument for/against early sport specialization and just said it in a more sophisticated manner than I ever could. Because I am a huge proponent that early sport specialization, I think, completely gets mislabeled.
Yeah.
That I don't care if an athlete only wants to play baseball their entire life. The specialization is doing the same thing over and over and over again. So if all you do is the same pitching lesson and try to throw the exact same way from age 12 to age 20, yeah, that's probably early sport specialization. But if you're playing every sport on the field and you're doing the training that you should do to support those things, you are not quote unquote specializing. You might care most about the sport of baseball compared to everything else. But if your training is done properly, so what? Who cares? It's exposing you to all the athletic demands that you could ever need. It doesn't matter if you're kicking a ball just to say you do a different sport.
I'm so glad you said that. And this is the soapbox that I've been on for years because it's the catch-22, right? Like we have all these parents that heard the like 10,000 hours rule, right? Like all these people that get to the elite level of sport, they did, at least 10,000 hours and it takes so much time to be really good at one thing. And let's be honest, baseball is a skill-based sport. You have to be really good at some very specific skills that take a crap ton of time to get really good at. And it is such an all-encompassing baseball. Little League travel ball culture is wild. And if you want to be competitive, you have to play the game. Like your kid can't play in the spring every year until he's 17 and expect to be competitive. Like that's just the reality. So there's this, kind of these two different schools of thought of we know the research tells us early sports specialization, your kid's probably not going to make it to an elite level and they're most likely going to get very injured. But then we take the 10,000 hour rule and we say, but also your kid needs to be playing so much baseball to be good at it. So how do we not specialize them, but also get them to play so much baseball that they can actually get to an elite level? And the answer is you need to create variability within the sport. They should be playing every position. They also, I tell people all the time, especially your younger kids, which I know expense, time, this is all a barrier, but as much as you can, your kid should be training outside of baseball. They need to be doing some sort of strength and conditioning. They need to be doing some sort of athletic agility, speed, like other kind of stuff that's all going to lend itself to baseball, but isn't specifically like a throwing drill, a hitting drill. Do you know what I mean? Like they're getting that at practice. They don't necessarily need extra pitching lessons. They need to be doing something that's going to train just overall athleticism that's going to lend itself to baseball, but something that's not baseball specific training. And then let your kid play basketball on the weekends. Like take your trip to the lake and let them learn how to wakeboard. Like allow your kid to go skiing if you go on vacation, right? Like, there's so many baseball parents that are like, my kid never skied because I was so afraid he's going to get hurt. I'm like, okay, so we don't need to sign them up for 8 different sports to avoid specialization, but they have to be able to live their life. That's going to add specialization, shooting hoops with friends on the weekends, like going out to the lake on vacation, wakeboarding, like all this stuff is developing athleticism within a kid that's going to add variability. But anyways, if you can't do all those things, play every position outside of baseball. That's how you're going to get away from that early specialization.
Yes, so we are both to blame for this tangent, but back to the original question, which you laid fantastic groundwork for, the different flags that you're normally seeing popping up in the high-level biomech reports. So it was really hard not to continue down that path, so maybe we'll go back there eventually. But just the fact that I asked this question, I was going to feel really bad for either the listeners or myself that it didn't get answered.
Yes. So the most common issues, and I know you mentioned my talk at the Bridge Seminar in 2022. So another soapbox is there's so many things we can measure in a biomechanics report. What data points actually matter? Because I can list a bunch of things in a biomechanics report that may not be optimal, but we have to be able to look at which variables are results and which ones are causes. So cause and effect, right? And a lot of times we're trying to change things that are effects, and you're going to go down a rabbit hole, make yourself crazy. You're going to make your athlete really cognitive and in their head, and it's never going to actually change what needs to change. My favorite example of this is lead leg blocking. That is such a result of what you do on the backside, not the front side, unless an athlete is specifically weak, which if you're at a high level, if you're in even the minor leagues or big leagues, like you're probably not weak. It's probably a mechanics issue. But anyways, I digress. So the issues that I think are actually causes and big time red flags is one, how we use the back leg. Essentially, does the back leg rotate? Does it rotate in time? And does it rotate all together? A big one that I see is that the athlete will initiate rotation at the femur, so that you'll see the hip start to rotate. So basically the knee starts to turn towards the ground and the lower leg is not rotating. So basically that athlete is staying foot congruent with the rubber and that heel stays down. I need to see that whole leg rotate together. And this one's really easy to feel if you get into like a wide leg stance, like as if you're in your stride, and then you keep your foot flat on the ground, toes facing, if you're right-handed, toes facing third base, keep your foot flat on the ground, and then turn your knee down as hard as you can, versus get in that stance and then like you're smushing a bug, turn your hip as hard as you can, but let your foot come with it and really drive from the ground with your foot. So you're driving rotation bottom up instead of at the top by itself. So instead of just at the hip, you're driving rotation starting at the foot with the hip. And when you get that whole leg to rotate together, you are creating so much more power out of the ground. You're actually creating that rotational ground reaction force, and you can feel the difference. So that's the first one, is how an athlete uses the back leg. If we're getting basically hip rotation in isolation, or if that whole leg's rotating together. The other big one is matching planes of rotation. So the easy one to see is the upper arm and the torso. So if I drew a line from shoulder joint to shoulder joint and then connected those two dots, basically whatever angle that line is, the upper arm needs to match that angle as it's unwinding. If it is too high or too low, the angular momentum that you're creating at your torso, angular momentum is directional. If your arm is not in line with your torso, that transfer of momentum is not going to be optimal. We actually create some deceleration. And then you basically have to, in order to pick up speed again at the arm, you have to rely on internal torque, so muscular demand. All that to say, it is one of the biggest indicators of increased elbow torque and injury. Going to shout out Jimmy Buffy with Reboot Motion. They actually did a study on the data that they had with professional pitchers. And one of the biggest correlations they saw were guys whose arms did not match plane of rotation and elbow torque injuries. So, or increased what we call varus loading or varus torque, which is what tears your UCL, and arm injuries. That was most correlated with not matching planes of rotation. And I think he presented that data either in 2022 at the Bridge Seminar or 2023.
That was the 23.
That was 23. So that's a big one. But the other one that we don't often see that can kind of cause that mismatch in angular momentum is if you look at the pelvis. The other big one that can set you up to not match a plane's rotation further down the delivery is what angle you're rotating that pelvis. A lot of times, I think in an effort to like generate momentum and kind of backload before they go off the mound, sometimes pitchers will angle their pelvis uphill, essentially, even though they're about to move downhill. Torso sits on top of the pelvis, you get a torso tilt that goes with it. Now your torso, the plane of rotation your torso is moving in is totally altered, or you have to come out of that plane of rotation that you just set yourself up in. So that could be an issue too. But overall, that whole bucket is whether or not you match planes of rotation, pelvis, torso, arm. The big one most people know about is forearm flyout. So basically, if the pitcher never gets that ball inside of 90 before they start to lay back and get to max external rotation, that one adds a ton of extra torque, essentially because you're adding drag on the elbow. Those would be my big ones. Those are my big red flags. There's a ton of other things that we can see that go wrong in a delivery. A lot of them are we can trace all the way back to basically those three things. How did you use your back leg? Do you match planes of rotation? Is your arm path what we would call healthy? Which to me is two criteria. Does that ball make it inside the pocket? And does your arm match planes of rotation? Those are my big red flags. Those are all things I think are worth addressing.
And just additional clarification on the forearm flyout, since of course this is a podcast, so not everyone will be watching. I just want to reiterate, when you were explaining it, you said it's about getting the forearm inside 90 prior to max layback, correct?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I always think that's a helpful point to hammer home, because you think about the conversations that we have. It's the theory of the unwinding of the arm or the natural whip has become so much more commonplace. But then you have people that say, well, what about forearm flyout? Doesn't that mean my forearm's flying out because my arm is shooting out away from my body? But that is occurring after maximum external rotation. So that's just catching the energy that you've transferred up through the arm, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes when we talk about forearm flyout, so yes, obviously that forearm is going to quote unquote fly out as you get towards release, but we look at timing of that. So you look at timing of elbow extension velocity. If that's happening early, we can consider that forearm flyout. But the other issue is basically before you hit max external rotation, does that ball sneak towards your shoulder just to the inside of your elbow? You want to see you hit that pocket. And then we do look at the timing of when that elbow extension happens after max external rotation. And we basically time that up with when the torso has finished its rotation. So basically, if the torso and elbow are moving away from each other too soon, the arm is left out to dry. Like they're rotating away from each other. Basically, the torso should finish its rotation and then the arm is whipping behind it. If they're still rotating out away from each other, that is also sometimes considered forearm flyout.
Right. That is what we would see, I guess, in our common coaching vernacular as arm drag to an extent.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Our less biomechanical terms, just what we like to say, either arm drag or pushy arm or whatever. Yeah, but you start to see the head and the hand working away from each other to an extent.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Another point that I wanted to hit on when you're talking about these red flags, biomech reports, you talked about the hips or the pelvis working upward, although we are trying to go down the slope. And there are pieces here that I think get difficult when you start to consider pitcher individuality and what makes them successful in a sense of their ability to hide the ball or be funky, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Where or how, that's probably not even the right way to ask it. When would you intervene if you see something that might pop up as a flag, but it enables an athlete to do something that is outlier or produce a result that helps them cash a check at the end of the day?
Yep. Great question. Not everything is optimal, but not everything is a problem. So sometimes there are pitchers that do things that you're like, that's not the most optimal thing you could be doing. But the answer is, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So I have two reasons why I would make a biomechanical change on somebody. They are in pain or got injured. And so obviously we need to change something. Or they have a performance issue. They do not throw hard enough, or they've lost velocity. I am a big believer in this, is that biomechanics are for two reasons. They are for health and efficiency, which go hand in hand, right? A lot of people try to connect certain biomechanical variables and things like strike percentage or command. There is no research to show that there are specific correlations with specific biomechanical markers and performance metrics like ball flight data, strike percentage, things like that. But what we do know is there are biomechanical markers that are very strongly correlated with injury risk and with velocity. So I'm very careful not to make biomechanical changes and then promise a pitcher that he's going to be a better pitcher, if that makes sense. All that being said, I think there's two reasons to change the way somebody moves. One, they need to add velocity, or two, they have pain or an injury that we need to work with. And so if a pitcher comes into the lab and they want an evaluation, they're throwing 97 and they have no pain, and I see something that's not optimal, if their elbow torque numbers are not catastrophic, and I don't see any indicator of like, you're a ticking time bomb, you're going to get injured, I'm not changing it because it's part of who they are. And biomechanical changes, especially at the higher level, big league level, guys with a lot of service time, to change a movement pattern at that point can really mess people up. And you can change the identity of a pitcher, right? Like these really elite guys, hopefully, and most of them do, they know who they are. They know what they're good at. They know how they get guys out. Now, if you put them on the mound and they're thinking about how they move and they're trying to do something different, you can really mess somebody up. So there has to be a strong reason why I'm making a biomechanical change, and I'm not going to make biomechanical changes with false promises. And I think false promises are your command's going to be better. Your first strike percentage is going to be better. Things like that. There might be something out there, and someone might do a research study and prove me wrong. Currently, we do not have any evidence to say if your pelvis opens 60 degrees at landing, you have better command. We don't know that. So that being said, velocity and injury, those are the two reasons I'm making changes. If those two things are not a problem, I'm probably not making changes, even if you're not quote unquote off.
The piece that I want to hammer home, again, just trying to focus on takeaway messages. You mentioned making a change won't necessarily make someone a better pitcher. The way that I wanted to phrase it, or how I received what you said, is there is a stark difference between an efficient thrower and an effective pitcher. And those two aren't always the same thing.
And this is where I think we've gotten so much better from when I first started being in the baseball biomechanics space to now. We've gotten so much better at integrating departments. But I think we can still do a better job in that sometimes biomechanists get so in the weeds of data and movement that they see anything that doesn't look good or doesn't look efficient or could be improved, and they're pumping out changes. Hey, you need to do this. They're sending pitching coaches, FYI, his lead leg extension's a little bit slower than MLB average. Okay, but we always have to bring it back to a pitcher is good if they can get guys out. At the end of the day, that's the bottom line. I need to help pitchers get guys out and not be injured. So if what I'm doing is not going to help them get guys out, I shouldn't be doing it. Unless they are injured, and I need to fix an injury. Okay. That's my caveat, right? But this is why it's so important to collaborate and integrate with people who are purely on the performance side of pitching. So biomechanists need to be talking to pitching strategists and pitching coaches and guys who are just in the performance space, because they're the ones that know what this guy looks like on the mound. They're the one that knows what their TrackMan data looks like and knows how they get outs and knows that their stuff plays up and down or east and west, or you know what I mean? Like they're the ones who say like, they're the ones that are responsible for making changes with these pitchers, but they're also the ones that can add that color from a performance perspective. This is what this guy needs to do. And if we change this, we're changing who he is. Big red flag, right? So it's gotten so much better, but the world of sports science needs to continue to integrate better with these people who are the performance experts and who are the specifically baseball experts, right? I'm lucky that I have Mike McFerrin to really like integrate with. So him and I run the lab together in Irvine. He's obviously looking at everything from a pitching strategy perspective, and then I'm looking at everything from a biomechanics perspective and being able to marry those and decide what changes actually make sense for a pitcher. And, and sometimes he's working with a guy and he's just like, he'll just give me a quick, like, here's a video of this guy, anything I need to be concerned with. So he's basically asking me, like, are there red flags here? And if there's not red flags, we aren't making changes. So sometimes it's just quick, like, can I roll with what this guy got? And that now I'm just working on grips or teaching him to tunnel these 2 pitches, or like, can it be purely a strategy thing? Or like, do we actually need to change the way this guy moves? And I wish more pitching performance centers and I wish more teams had the chance to integrate in that way, because I think it allows biomechanics to be so much more actionable. And the biggest gripe I hear from teams with biomechanics is like, they're just shoveling out data and they don't know what it means. They don't know how to use it, or they feel like I'm making these changes that are making guys worse.
Before we do move on to another topic, I want you to shout out anything you need to that you and Mike are doing, whether it's how people can get in touch with you guys if they want to be assessed or work with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mike and I work together at the pitching lab down in Irvine. We do every eval together. He is analyzing pitching performance. So he's looking at all the ball flight data. So looking at edgertronic cameras, TrackMan, and kind of getting the performance history of the athlete. And then I'm looking at all the biomechanics. So all the physics of how the pitcher is moving and what the actual delivery looks like and all of that data. And then we write reports together and create basically a pitching development plan for the athlete, go over it with them. And so, yeah, I'd really like to say that we kind of take pitching from both angles, from the medical side and from the performance side, and try to figure out something that is going to make the pitcher the best pitcher possible and not just the best thrower, right? Because there's a lot of guys that throw really hard and are not playing professionally right now because they don't have good stuff, or they don't know how to use it, or all that. So I feel like it's really important to marry the two. And yeah, we're in Irvine. If people want to get an evaluation, they can email me at emily@ferreesportslab.com, or they can visit our Instagram page and message us. Those would probably be the 2 best ways to schedule.
Perfect. Yes, I wanted to make sure that you got that in there, because you talked about the great things you did, but want to make sure people know how to access the great things that you do.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. And this might be a funky one for you, so definitely feel free to pivot if we need to. I want to backtrack in some of your earlier work and talk about some of the research that you were involved in, if possible, because I know early on you were involved with some studies when you were really, I think, first hitting the scene with what you do on the biomech side, as well as a physical therapist, with how a few mechanical actions impact arm torque. If I'm not mistaken, weren't you involved in like the recoil arm study that Eugene Bleecker and his crew did?
Yeah. Just for the science community out there, I want to be careful of calling it a study. We didn't publish anything. We basically, I'm going to call it an experiment. We basically took things in the lab, we measured it, we tested it, calculated the data, looked at differences. We didn't publish anything that requires IRBs and like all sorts of organizational stuff that at the time a 1-woman lab operation was not going to do, but we measured and studied some things and then presented those findings. We did not publish any studies. But that was a really interesting one where at the time, I don't think it's as big of an issue now, but at the time, there was a big kind of old school mantra going around about teaching pitchers to finish in their back pocket, like get their arm to their opposite back pocket and kind of pull that arm through to protect the shoulder and elbow. And basically a lot of guys would naturally kind of finish and their arm would kind of fly back into this recoil. And that was being coached out of a lot of, especially young players, it's being coached out of them. They're being taught not to do that until like, basically, they call it finish strong, like pull that back elbow, like keep your arm at your side. And Eugene just kind of intuitively was like, that doesn't make sense. And guys who he called it pimping the finish. So like I see all these big leaguers that pimp the finish and they look amazing. Like I don't think we should be coaching recoil out of somebody. I think it's natural. I think we should do it, but he didn't really have the science behind like, why is that better? And so we just ran a really simple study where we had a lot of kids come through who he was training with at the time, and we had them throw 2 different ways. We had them finish into their back pocket, and then he specifically coached them to kind of pimp the finish and pull their arm into that recoil. And we saw a pretty massive decrease in elbow torque. I don't remember what the numbers were at the time. This was a lot of years ago.
Right. This was 2018, wasn't it?
That sounds about the right time frame. Like I said, I'm not exactly sure what year it was. So we saw a pretty big decrease in elbow torque. We also saw some mechanical changes in arm path that looked better. And now looking back, knowing more than I did at the time, I think what Pimping the Finish was doing was it was putting the arm in plane with the torso. So basically, and again, this is all hypothesis based, but I think what it was doing was basically from a motor control standpoint, like back chaining. Basically, the pitcher had in their mind, by the time I end my delivery, my arm needs to be right here. And so they're putting their arm there to then come back to there, if that makes sense. So they're putting their arm where they knew they needed to go back to previously, if that makes sense. So I think there was some reverse chaining going on from a motor control standpoint that put their arm in plane with their torso, and an arm in plane with the torso is going to have decreased varus torque. And usually it helps with velocity too, because it helps with that angular momentum transfer from torso to arm. So looking back at that study and what we were doing, I think that's what was going on. But what we measured was a pretty significant decrease in elbow torque when they did that recoil.
Kind of bringing us full circle in a sense when we started with the motor learning principle with, I guess, a softball is an external load, but it is kind of funky when I think about this, although there is an intrinsic approach to it, like an athlete is internally trying to cue themselves to get back to a certain point. To me, you could almost think about it as if it is external because it is happening after release. So it is kind of, to me, like the motor learning conversation that we started with in the softball world.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's kind of a version of that. And that's the same thing when we make movement changes, even though you're trying to get an athlete to think about something internal, essentially, because you're talking about their body and the way they're moving. We try and make it as external to the delivery as possible. So for example, a lot of times what we're doing to, for example, affect the back leg, instead of when they're at their max speed mid stride, make a change, we're trying to set them up in their knee lift better. We're trying to like basically do something that's going to like set the marbles up to roll down the hill in a certain direction versus trying to get them midway down the hill doing something different, if that makes sense. So even though it's technically an internal cue, you're trying to make it as external to the main delivery as possible.
Right. It's harder to speed up once you're already going. You might as well set yourself up for success from the beginning.
Yep.
For sure. Well, Emily, we have covered a ton, and what I think is kind of funny when I look at this prep sheet, I think maybe we got to like 2 of the talking points on there because we just went so heavy on the rehab route from the jump, which I love. It's why we do it this way. Is there anything major that you think we missed before we have to let you go? Of course, there's tons of things. So maybe it's the fun fact or something that you're really into right now that you think is coming down the line in the research world or in the physical therapy world or performance world?
Gosh, that's a good question. I don't even know where to go with that. I think, well, here's an interesting one from the biomechanics. Again, so we talked about Mike from a performance standpoint is the one who's really evaluating like ball flight data and ball characteristics. And then I'm looking more at the body. Mike and I have not figured this out yet, but what's next on our plate is really trying to correlate and marry the two together. So looking at the specific spin characteristics that a pitcher may have and looking at what biomechanics may or may not feed that and helping to optimize that. So part of obviously getting better spin, and this is your world, is strengthening the fingers and the forearm, right? But is there a way that we can set the body up to set the hand up, essentially? So, looking at like maybe a guy looking at his unique plane of rotation that he creates in his delivery, and then looking at the way his hand spins the ball. Is there a way that we can maybe make a guy very deceptive because maybe he's a very flat rotator, but he gets a ton of backspin? You wouldn't necessarily expect that. You'd expect a guy that's a little bit more sidearm, a little bit more flat rotator to cut the ball more. So basically, can we trick batters by getting a guy who rotates in one plane of motion but spins the ball in another? Things like that, of trying to marry those two together a little bit, I think is probably the next the next frontier for biomechanics and pitch data to correlate a little bit more. So we're still playing with that right now. And I know from a research perspective, so I'm a peer reviewer for the American Journal of Sports Medicine for specifically biomechanics papers. And I know some of the research that is coming out right now is finally looking at not just biomechanical data and velocity, but we're actually looking at a couple of papers are in the works right now to look at spin and correlating with elbow torque and things like that. So I think that is very important for both injury prevention and performance training to realize the way that somebody spins the ball, how that correlates with elbow torque and injury. Because obviously we know the harder you throw, the more torque is going to go through your elbow. Velocity increases torque at the elbow, but fastballs aren't generally what blow guys' elbows out. Breaking balls do. Certain spin does. There's a reason we don't tell young kids to throw curveballs and things like this, even though those are slower pitches. So it's counterintuitive, right? So we are finally looking at, even though they're slower pitches, what about the way they're spinning the ball is increasing elbow torque? And I know you guys have some really interesting data about when the arm is supinated, that the forearm is weaker. And I just think we are on the brink of potentially really affecting some injury risk characteristics for pitchers without decreasing performance, because this is the big unsolvable problem with the MLB, right? Pitchers are getting better and better and better. They're throwing harder and harder and harder. They have nastier and nastier stuff. I mean, I just saw a pitcher who had like 21 inches of run on one of his balls. And it's like, you are spinning the ball like crazy, sir. And there's some of these guys that are cutting the ball so hard, which from a performance standpoint is amazing, but from an injury risk standpoint is catastrophic. And so from a performance standpoint, we're getting these pitchers to a place where the game is progressing at such a rapid speed, the body is not catching up. So in order to prevent injuries, we have to tell pitchers not to be as nasty, which is not good for the game and will never happen. Or we just have to accept that 10 players I just looked at these stats the other day because one of my pitchers was asking me about it. On average, 10 guys per organization are getting TJ every year, majors and minors, and the number is rising. We either just have to accept hey, if you're going to be elite, you are going to blow out. As a physical therapist, I don't want to accept that. Or we have to say, just don't throw as hard or be as good. From a performance standpoint, nobody wants to say that. So I think finally being able to marry spin data, ball flight data with biomechanics and strength data of the arm, if we can marry those things and figure out how to get these guys to spin the ball in nasty ways and still keep their elbow protected, could be very interesting for the game.
I think that was the perfect mic drop finish. That was tremendous, Emily. That was an awesome take. I love it. I'm excited and want to keep going. But of course, life doesn't always work that way. So now I'm probably going to be blowing you up, trying to find out more of what you're thinking, just to figure out what's next. What can we do to get there sooner? But Emily, thanks a ton for hopping on with us today. Everybody, definitely encourage you to reach out if you have questions. As Emily said, she is available. She is trying to help athletes get better, get healthier, and improve what they do. So Emily, once again, thanks a ton. And to all the listeners, thanks for laying back with us.